Thank you, Disha, and thank you, Kalpana, for enlightening us about how women with the same education and talent can build the same net worth as men. With this, we are coming towards the end of the conference, towards an action plan. Where do we go from here? What do we do next? And for this, I would like to request Peggy Clark, CEO and President of ICRW, International Center for Research on Women. Throughout her career, Peggy has worked tirelessly to address unequal gender norms, women's economic empowerment, health, and climate action. And in conversation with Peggy will be Ipsita Kathuria, who I dare not introduce again. Over to you, Ipsita and Peggy.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and a very good evening to all our listeners. Happy to be back with you again, and I hope you've enjoyed and learned from the discussions in the last 2.5 days. As we bring our conference to close, I am absolutely delighted and honored to welcome and introduce Peggy Clark, our valedictory speaker for the conference. Who better than her to talk about the way forward to build the equiverse that we all aspire for? Peggy is the CEO and President of International Center for Research on Women. ICRW advances the rights and opportunities of women and girls around the world through research and advocacy. Peggy has devoted over 3 decades of her career to work tirelessly to tackle and address unequal gender norms, such as women's economic security, health, and well-being. Just the very topic of our discussion for the last 2 days. So prior to ICRW, she has worked with Aspen Global Innovators Group, founded her own organization named Realizing Rights with the President of Ireland, worked with the Ford Foundation and Save the Children. In every place she has worked, she has left a deep mark with many accolades. Details of her achievements can be seen on the platform. Do take some time and look at all that she has been able to achieve in her career. Her depth of knowledge around all that we have discussed in the last 2.5 days regarding gender parity would provide us an excellent rounding off to the conference and show us a way forward, especially as to what can be done to progress faster on bridging the gender gap. How can each of us play a role? It is very, very important that we do not assign this responsibility to different agencies like the government and the social sector or the private sector. Each of us need to play a role in bringing about this equity, and Peggy is here to guide us and give us her insights around this. So welcome, Peggy, to Talentnomics India's 7th International Leadership Conference. Really happy to have you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful and generous introduction, Ipsita. It's an honor to be here with you all, and it's an honor to be a capstone conversation with you around this really important topic, and wealth, well-being, and work. I love the way you have framed it, and I am really honored to have listened and to have learned from the previous conversations you've had. So thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you. And I'm so glad again to, have this conversation with you on this very important topic. So to start off, Peggy, I want to read something from the ICRW's website, which really struck me. It says, gender inequity lies at the root of every major problem the world faces. And so gender must inform every solution, from creating sustainable business practices to expanding opportunities for the youth, to addressing the ever-changing health challenges, or as we call well-being challenges globally. Mm-hmm. This really struck me as to, how center of the stage the whole gender equity is, and how much scope there is to bring about change in this area. So what an amazing goal of ICRW. So, just that we have concluded these 2 days of discussion around work, wealth, and well-being, I want to just ask one initial question to you. We have been discussing about work. The work issue has been deliberated on for quite some time, quite a few years now, the disparity in work. Well-being, on the other hand, is just getting some attention, especially post-COVID. We're talking about more openly about well-being of women. Wealth, in my understanding, is yet to get any focus. The wealth disparity between gender hasn't got the focus it deserves. And you have done a lot of research around all these various aspects related to women. Can you share with us some optimistic news on the progress on all these aspects to start off this discussion?
Yes. Thank you so much for that lovely question. And, I'm really honored to be a part of this important conversation you're having. And let me just start by saying, the quote that you found on our International Center for Research on Women website is so important, because one of the things that this moment in time have made us realize is that women really, gender equality is central to progress on any of the issues we're facing as a society: climate change, economic growth, food insecurity, health challenges. It is not possible for us to all make progress together unless we put women at the center of those solutions, and not just as a nice to have or as a moral responsibility. But if we truly believe that investing in women is a part of the solution to each of those problems. So, in terms of your question about optimism, and it's an important one because we are going through a difficult time as a world right now. And in many ways, we're in the midst of a perfect storm, but also we're in the midst of a sort of perfect awakening about the role of gender equality as a mainstream key issue for creating healthier societies. And so, I would ask our audience, how many of us struggled through these last several years of COVID, when the children were not able to go to school, to take care of children, to take care of our elderly family members who were sick, to also meet our work responsibilities, working from home, going in sometimes. Every single one of us realized something that we have known for a very long time, that women are largely responsible for the caregiving responsibilities, taking care of children, taking care of elderly, taking care of the sick, ensuring food is on the table in almost every society. And so we've always known that. And we've known that to be true. But what happened during this perfect storm of COVID is it shut whole nations down. Frankly, 40% of the women left the workforce during this time. And so many of my friends, and I'm sure many of yours, were in the bathroom. Their children were pounding on the door and they were trying to do a work call, or they were frantically trying to secure oxygen tents for their work colleagues or their family members. And so I think what we realized is we're all in this together, and there's an inextricable relationship between health and well-being and work effectiveness and the economy. So we've thought about health issues over here, we thought about economic issues over here, but we realize there's an inextricable linkage, and we're still in the middle of it. We're still in the middle of it. So we have this great awakening around that. And so you asked me what I'm optimistic about. I think that is a huge opportunity for us all to recognize, and you've used the frame of well-being. It's not just to say that our health issues are over here and we need to reduce infant mortality and we need to have viable health systems, and our economic issues are over here, but that people's lives and their care for their family and their productivity at work are really, really intertwined. And so this notion of the care economy, which I think in many ways is unpaid, and much of women's work is unpaid, has been kind of a sideline issue. It's been seen as, maybe not that significant for growing gross domestic product, for growing economies. And both companies and governments and families are realizing that issue of care, who takes care of the children, who makes sure they get to school, who takes care of the elderly parents, who's there to step in communities and neighborhoods to bring soup, to help get oxygen tanks, that it really is going to take all of us, and we cannot afford to sideline 51% of the population. So the things I'm optimistic about are there have been donors and governments that have stepped up to this right away. And so, for example, the World Bank and the Gates Foundation have created a major childcare fund. And they're now looking at how we can, as societies, invest in childcare. it's in almost every country, except for a few examples, it is not subsidized, and it is very difficult for women to find affordable and high quality childcare. But I think we have this awakening where we're saying, if we don't invest in this, we will see some of the results we're in the midst of right now, which is, for example, major learning declines as a result of children being out of school for 2 years, major losses to employees in almost every sector of every economy because women have had to step back out of the labor force. So we have this perfect storm crisis, the pandemic, economic pressures, that has brought this awakening, particularly around that notion of the centrality of women to healthy nations and the centrality of care and well-being to the way we think about the kind of world we want to live in.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there has been so much more discussion and focus around the issue. So the right word, as you said, is the awakening has happened. And even at the individual level, I have had friends and, colleagues whom I've heard from that the husbands are much more appreciative of what they do. So even at the individual level, there's been an awakening that they've really realized the responsibility and the load that their partners or their wives are carrying as they move through or juggling the various responsibilities. So yeah, I hope this awakening at the national level, at the organization level, and at the individual level will really see a faster growth. But my next question to you, Peggy, therefore, is what, as per you, have been the most difficult barriers to make a faster progress in these areas? What comes in the way of the change?
I think that's such a good question. And, I think when we look at where we've made progress for women over the last several decades, we have made progress in education for girls. We have made progress in women's health. We have made progress in children's health. But the areas where we haven't are economic opportunity and economic security. And so the point you're raising about attention to wealth rather than just participation in the workforce is a really important one. So a piece of that is pay equity. And obviously we know that women are not earning equal to men still, even though there's been some progress on that, and that women are not participating in the economy at equal levels as we want them to, and particularly in certain sectors like the science, the technology, the education, the information technology fields. But I want to touch on this point you raised about wealth and economic security. And that brings us to this point of economic resilience. And we've seen this during this awakening moment, which is it's not just whether you have a job and you can hold a job, but what are the resilient tools that give you a feeling that you can, over your whole lifetime and the lifetime of your family, survive. And a piece of that is asset ownership for women, of course. Women do not own land or assets, homes, cars at anywhere near the same rate as men. It's quite important that we recognize that gap and we work to rectify that gap. That's quite an important piece of the puzzle. Something that's interesting sort of globally, and I think in many ways India has led the way for this, is the role of women's economic collectives and women's economic cooperatives in helping to build economic resilience. And so we mentioned, for example, IPSITA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, our friend Nurima Nanavati and Ilavat and others who've led the way in recognizing women in the informal sector and in recognizing the economic contributions, even of very poor women. There is power in investing in economic collectives that allow group savings accounts, that advocate collectively for ownership of land and assets. There is something to be said for investing explicitly and recognizing more the role of economic collectives. So let me give you an example of something International Center for Research on Women is doing. We know that investing in women is a really important part of addressing climate change. All of us need to be working on climate change right now. It is going to influence us and our children and generations to come forever. But did you know that of all the money that's going into climate finance and reducing emissions, less than 2% goes to women-led climate initiatives.
Wow.
And so with Self-Employed Women's Association, Rima Nanavati and us and other colleagues have gotten together to do a major set of research with the Rockefeller Foundation and Asian Development Bank and other partners that brings data to bear to say that women-led climate action can be effective, both in creating jobs and employment for women, but also in reducing carbon emissions. And so an example of that is in Gujarat, Self-Employed Women's Association is working with salt pan workers around the salt extraction. And that is a collective of 8,000 women. Those 8,000 women were primarily dependent upon diesel-operated water pumps as part of the salt extraction process. And they, as a group, transformed all of those diesel pumps to solar pumps. And so there was a huge renewable energy saving. And then beyond that, they recognize the importance of investing in renewable energy and the economic opportunities there. So they purchased a set of land and they created a huge solar farm that is generating energy, which they are selling. So it is not only increasing the incomes of those 8,000 women in the collective, but also it is reducing carbon emissions significantly by helping a country like India to change from its dependence on fossil fuels to solar energy. So that the missing piece there, and to your point of wealth and resilience, that would not have happened if those women were not in a collective. And there are pockets of examples of women's led climate action, but we need to make this part of mainstream conversation. And so we at ICRW are doing a set of research to bring just the pure numbers to bear. What are the effects of this? How are women's incomes being raised or not? How are their jobs being raised or not? How are carbons being reduced? And the effects are quite significant and at scale. And this has caught the eyes of major development banks. We're bringing this forward to the climate talks that are happening next month. We're launching this work. But, you know, I think the point is that people think of issues related to women and gender equality as sort of nice to or on the side. So rather than looking at women as victims, what if we looked at women as superpower or engines or almost force multipliers for helping us together to address these major problems?
Absolutely. I mean, what an amazing project. You know, thanks for sharing that. You know, it just shows the potential of women. Earlier in this conference, we've talked about a couple of other points, you know, sort of related. One is if in women-led businesses, the opportunities to employ women is much higher than men-led businesses. There's been research around it. It's been shown, and that's true with urban enterprises, that when women start a business, they employ more women. And you know, obviously, this is now true even in the rural and the informal sector, as you're saying. And the second point you made is the whole concept of sisterhood, the whole concept of joining hands and moving things together, which is very, very important if you want to see faster progress in this area. And it was mentioned by our guest of honor at the beginning of the conference too, as to how important it is for women to give a lending hand to other women if you want to, you know, see progress and bring about gender equity. Really valuable learnings here. Okay, so my next question to you, we did talk a little bit about, you know, wealth and you know, economic security. The next question is about well-being. The well-being of women is so dependent on their ability to work, their ability to earn and save. At the same time, their well-being and their health also in turn impacts their ability to work and earn and save. It's a catch-22 situation. These issues are also directly related to climate change, larger global relations. There are so many issues that are there together. And you did talk a little bit about it, but I just want to understand, how can we as a collective address all these issues at once? You know, how do we build that momentum to address so many, you know, different issues?
Right. I love that question, and it's a really important one. And I love your framing in terms of well-being. So two things. One is, I talked at the beginning about this notion of this awakening. So we saw the bringing together of health and economy and productivity as it's happening in COVID, still happening right now. So we see the interrelationship between those issue areas. But I think to your question about how you can see women at the table, women central, and how we can integrate these issues of climate change, economy, health, well-being. I heard this phrase the other day. We're in the middle of a political season in the United States. As you know, it's so stressful for everyone when we're going through this. But I heard someone say this particular person was bringing forward kitchen table issues. And so what they meant by that was quality of education, safety of children, access to vaccines and basic medicine, inflation, unemployment, people's ability to get jobs. And I thought about that idea of the kitchen table, and it's not, those are traditionally thought of as women's issues, but really we all sit at that table together, men and women, grandparents, children, everybody. It brings to mind something that's so interesting to me. Some of the countries that have had women leaders, and there are still not very many yet in the world, have brought forward these kitchen table issues, fundamental issues to humanity, at the national level. So one example of that is President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia. She was the first woman president of Liberia. Liberia had gone through years and years of civil strife. People were not able to walk safely in the streets. Children were not able to get to schools. Women were not safe being in the street. So she, after years, decades of conflict, was able to say, the platform I'm running on as a politician is, you need to be able to get your children safely to school. You need to be able to put food on the table. You need to be able to have a job and get there safely. And she was able to transform Liberia into a country that's peaceful by not focusing just on the civil conflict, but by bringing forward these really very human issues of what we all care about all over the world. Can we feed our children? Can we give them an education? Are we all safe? Can we have productive work that gives us some stability and meaning in our lives? Another interesting example is, and this is not true in every case, but some of the countries that handled COVID the best were led by women. One example is New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. She immediately brought the issue of equity forward. So she didn't say only people of wealth are going to have access to vaccines. She said, we have to make this equitable for everyone. So she immediately went to community household level to say this is affecting everyone. She also completely prioritized children and families immediately in her response. And there was really, one might say, a very human approach or kitchen table issues. So I think part of what we can do here, as you're suggesting, how do we bring these issues together, is to return again to what are our most fundamental needs as human beings. How do we survive and thrive? And those are echoed at the national level. What do we believe in? The right to education, the right to health, the right to work, the right to safety and security. But I want to also just touch for a minute on your point about well-being, Ipsita. And I want to say that, I recently went to visit our office, International Center for Research on Women office in Delhi, and I hope to return very often. It was just wonderful. And that our team there has been for 15 years, have made wonderful contributions to a lot of key issues. And I went around the table and I asked everyone, what are our biggest challenges? What are our biggest strengths? And what are your dreams or opportunities for the future? And people said pretty traditional things, but the young people around the table said, can we flip the narrative from women as victims to women's well-being? And is there a way, rather than always talking about this from a deficit perspective, what are women lacking? Can we instead say, what do women bring to the table, and how can we nurture and allow that to blossom? And so that links back to some of what our conversation has been here today, Sita, which is, rather than saying women and children are going to be washed away by the floods of climate change, which is true, could we also say, how can we invest in them and their energy and solutions and agency to help us solve the problems. So this concept of well-being is very profound, and I think can really help us to link environmental challenges, economic challenges, health challenges together in a way that is quite important for the future.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you so much. I think I really love the point that, how we do integrate, keeping well-being as the center of the theme. How can we then channel all the problems to find the solution that leads to well-being, not only of women, but everyone, and well-being of women leads to well-being of the world and well-being of everybody. And I guess that is the link pin to finding solutions in all areas, whether it's climate change or whether it is health related issues. So thank you so much for giving us that. There's another problem which, we did talk about asset and building net worth and what is all happening in Seva to do that. That was an excellent example that was happening. But, there is still this whole notion of women having less control on their finances. When they work, they earn less for the same work. And when they earn, they spend more of that percentage of that money on the health and education of their family. And what they save, they have much less control on their saving. The society, at least in South Asia or India, is such that the husbands or family members have more of a say on what you can invest on, how you can use your own saving for women. So there has been some talk about financial inclusion, financial independence, but the gap still remains very high. How do we bring about a change? What do we do to be able to help women to become, not only, include women in all the financial decision, but have them have a greater say on the financial decisions in their life?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. And we have been talking very optimistically, you and I, in this conversation so far. So I think it's really important we bring in the reality factor. And so we know that this is a persistent problem, that women earn less than men and save less than men and have less control over assets. We also know that in many ways, women are going backwards in terms of their rights to access to healthcare around the world, their rights and freedom of movement. Also, gender-based violence during COVID has increased in every country of the world. And so some of these are really persistent problems. And so we need to ask, well, how do we get that unstuck? What does that mean? And so I'm really honored to be a part at International Center for Research of Women of trying to look under the hood of that, because we can't just talk about women's issues without talking about men. It sounds obvious, but it's really true. And so International Center for Research on Women has been a part of a study that's been going on for more than 12 years of 67,000 men all over the world from 30 countries. And some of the questions that it asked are around decision-making in the home. What do you think the roles of women should be? Who makes decisions? Who's responsible for taking care of the household? Who's responsible for the children? Other questions around violence against women. Do you believe that? Do you have violence? Is there violence in your home? Do you believe? And some of the findings are absolutely remarkable. Even talking with men about who have committed violence against women, why they have done so. And we know that these are just deeply rooted stereotypes that are they're not at a conscious level. We live them as society. We still do believe women are less than men. That there's no question about that. We see that in every society. So we've been a part of kind of looking under the hood. So an interesting example, some of the results of that survey, which we've done with other partners, show that in households where there has been violence and where men or women experienced it, it tends to happen at the next generation. And it's almost as if it's wired into people's psyche or conscious that that's okay. Another issue that they found is that households where there were traditional roles and where men did not do caregiving or cleaning of the household and believed that women, that was perpetuated in the next generation. And the only places where there was change from generation to generation is where there was an example. So for example, if there was a household where the woman had decision-making power and where the man did some household chores and also caregiving, their children's households lived in that same way. So broke those gender norms. And so that kind of implies that there's a different sort of model, even, maybe a media campaign or something that allows us to believe that it's possible for a man to do the dishes after dinner or to cook dinner or to put the children to bed, that it's possible for a child of an abuser to not do the same for his mother. But these are deep, 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 deep issues. And I think for some of these persistent challenges with gender equity, we need to look under the hood. And so International Center for Research on Women, along with our partners, we've been working in the schools in many states in India on a program called GEMS, Gender Equality Movement, Equity Movement in Schools, and there are other names for this. But it's starting with young boys and girls and talking with them about how you perceive women, how you perceive violence, what makes you a good person, how do you feel about care? And it's just fascinating because the results are fabulous. And so maybe we really do need to look to our children and more explicitly try to build in the practice of equality and the values of equality at a very young age, because maybe we're too old to change. Maybe we are going to have to go to that level of confronting gender beliefs and norms to make a difference. And that's what we've seen. And in India is leading the way in some of this work in the schools for the world in these areas.
What fantastic work ICRW is doing. I'm really impressed. And yeah, it's so right that tackling the issue at that level is so important for the next generation to grow up with the belief that it is not okay to have this kind of a disparity or violence or, inequity in our homes. But yeah, you're right. It's a long road. And but I'm optimistic that even our generation can change. Therefore, I'm going to ask you the next question. And that's going to be targeted specifically for the men in the audience. So my question is, if you're going to tackle the world's most pressing issues, which is gender equity currently, as we have just talked and acknowledged, we are going to need the support of men and boys. How can they support our fight for progress? And there are men in the audience, what message do you have for them? As I'm saying, I believe we can all change. So what is it that they can do to support this progress?
I think this is the great awakening of this question of gender equality right now. We really cannot do it alone. We are all in this together. We're confronting climate change. We're confronting the pandemic. We cannot do this alone, and women's issues are not separate. There's no question that men and boys need to be actively involved in this. So what can men do? I think in corporations, a lot of corporations have risen because they've lost so much of their workforce. They recognize that they may have to subsidize childcare. They recognize they may have to have more flexible policies. They recognize they may have to implement paternity leave. So corporations and private sector can play a huge role in recognizing and just explicitly saying, we want men and boys to have the ability to be involved in some of the more traditional women's areas. That's a major issue. I talked to someone yesterday, Geeta Rao Gupta, who was the CEO of International Center for Reach on Women for a number of years. And she told me about a new book called Of Boys and Men. And that's fantastic. It's by someone named Richard Reeves, and it's just come out, and it says why the modern male is struggling, why it matters, and what we can do about it. And she said that a part of the study was quite interesting, where it talked about the same way we've been using this terminology STEM, science, technology, math, to get girls into the STEM sciences. This person proposes that we start a program called HEAL, HEAL, for men and boys. And what HEL stands for is health, education, administration, and literacy. And that we explicitly try to give men and boys opportunities to work in the areas of health, education, administration, and literacy, and value them for doing that. So rather than just focusing on changing the scenarios for women, explicitly allowing and encouraging men and boys to have heal opportunities, so that it nurtures their caregiving, it nurtures their it nurtures their sort of administration, education, health, those areas, so that the notion here is that men are also struggling with these notions of masculinity. You have to be the caregiver, you have to always be aggressive, you're not succeeding if you're spending too much at home and you're not outside. So I love that framing. So I think corporations have a major role to play. Policymakers have a major role to play in thinking about how we can change curriculums in schools to encourage men and boys in this way. I think also within families, why not, everybody who's in the room today, why not, when you go home tonight, think about the balance of who's doing what in your household and just take a step in the other direction. Both the woman would take a step towards the direction of what the man usually does, and the man would take a step. So you might do one thing that might speak to a yearning that you're having to do more healing and education and literacy. So find that part of yourself that wants to read a book with your child, that wants to make a wonderful sauce. And that might sound idealistic, but I think there is great power in men looking at themselves and saying how they could be better people by investing in that part, that caregiving part of themselves as well.
I mean, I love this heal concept, and I must get hold of this book and read this.
Me too. I just heard about it. So I think it's a very powerful idea, and I think it's
yeah. Good. No, I just think it's, addresses one of the nagging issues that's been in my mind, that, what has happened over the last generation is we have in some ways liberated the women, the girls. They are now out there wanting their space under the sky, but we haven't changed the attitude of our boys in that generation. They are still, reflecting what their fathers did or the grandfathers did. So we've actually created this perfect storm in men and women relationship, where the women are now becoming independent, and the men are don't know how to deal with that complete. So I think this is a great way forward, this heal concept, to do. So that's great. This is great advice. My last question to you, Peggy, before I let you go, is what is the one thing that I will tell you the groups after this? What is the one thing that they should stop doing? And what is the one thing that this group should start doing to make faster progress towards gender equitable world? Okay, so let's start with policymakers. What's the one thing that the policymakers should stop doing, and what's the one thing they should start doing?
Policymakers should recognize the particular constraints of the caregiving economy and see that as a real barrier to your economic progress as a nation. And so policymakers should ensure funding for social protections and initiatives that support women both in the informal economy and in the formal economy. So that may be childcare policies, that may be social protections, particularly for women in the informal sector. We saw the effects of COVID affect them so dramatically. So that's what policymakers should do. I think what they maybe should stop doing is looking at those things separately, like education, health, economy. Use the frame that you've used in this conference, work, wealth, well-being. Try to look at those things in an integrated way with the family and the household at the center. And stop having policies that are piecemeal, but integrate them in a way for a much greater outcome.
Yeah, I think that's great. This one more thing I think is very important, I feel the policymakers should bring about is have women in all major policy decisions that is being made. You know,
Yes.
it's, I think they just bring a different perspective, which might be missed out if policies are made by men for creating gender equity.
I
So
completely agree. I'm glad you raised that because that's essential and we're not there yet. Making
we are
some
not there.
progress, but we talked about Jacinda Ardern and
Yeah.
Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and the role of women's leadership, both in corporate and public sectors as critical.
Right.
See it differently. Yes.
The second group is academicians, researchers like you.
Right. We have to always connect our insights to action. And so really explicitly link the research, for example, on men and boys to what we could do about it. So that example of the HEAL paradigm is quite an interesting one. So academic nations need to always push themselves to speak to everyone, and distill the essence of your learnings so that people can take action on it, or else we can't build a better world. So that's what we should do. What we shouldn't do is just talk to ourselves. So there are plenty of academicians that are talking about gender equality, but we obviously are not moving the needle fast enough. And so ask yourself, how can what you're learning be brought into the hands of action makers and so that it can make a difference?
Excellent. And you did talk a little bit about what corporate houses can do and organized sector can do, but do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think specifically we talked about looking at childcare, paternity policies, flexible work, but I would add in that something that is so clear, which is explicitly address sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the workplace. We've made a lot of progress in that, but there's so much more to go, and ways that victims can come forward safely, ways that there is always an external advisor. There is best practice. Corporations can lead the way on this, and they can make a real difference. And then also just investing as corporations in women-led movements, or, for example, women's collectives that we've talked about in the informal sector. So making investments in women-led movements would be an important piece.
Absolutely, very critical. Again, here, I mean, one thing I feel the corporates are trying to do, but not gone very far, is having gender parity at the board level, you know, having
Yes.
equal number of women at the decision-making levels. We are so far behind there. We've been talking about it for so long. And that's what Talennomics is trying to do to, you know, to help organizations and enterprises have more gender parity at the leadership levels. And I think it's critical for many of the other things to happen, because you do bring that other perspective onto the table.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, the last group, the women and girls themselves. What should we stop doing from tomorrow, and what should we start doing for tomorrow if we want to see an equiverse?
We have to tell them they're amazing. We have to tell them we're right behind them. We're supporting you every step of the way. We need to bring their voices forward. New generations are seeing things in different ways than we are. They see the integration between environment, economy, health. They see the centrality of gender and in relation to that. So women and girls, confidence, confidence, confidence. Just tell them they're amazing. For those who are in the audience today, be brave. You are probably smarter than everyone else in the room. Don't be afraid to say what you need to say. And for us, IPCITA, you and me and other corporations, believe them, invest in them, bring their voices forward. They have many of the solutions. We need to embrace them and nurture them and pass the mic to them.
Right. Thank you so much. Absolutely well said. And we need to hold each other's hand and move forward, because we will move forward and we will see that better equiverse as we progress, you know, in our beliefs that we can see a better world. So thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I feel so energized by your energy and your resolve to solve this huge global issue.
Right.
We all know we have a long way to go, but it is very heartening to see the progress we have made and the work that is still going on in spite of all the turmoil and all the problems that we have had in the recent few years. It's also very encouraging to see more and more organizations are focusing on these issues at different levels. The private sector is into it, the social sector, the policymakers, people are focusing on these issues. But I think most importantly, it's great to believe that each of us can do something about it. And therefore, your last set of advice to each of the group is very timely and very relevant. It is the integrated effort for each of each of us that can turn the tide. Peggy, I always say, if each of us start a ripple of change and just do that one thing that will lead to bridging the gender gap, we can create a tsunami that can wash over our current universe and leave behind an equiverse. I do completely believe in it, and thank you so much for giving us the confidence that this can be done if we are all in it together.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to speak with you. It's been a lovely conversation, and I really hope everyone in our audience today takes your invitation to heart. What's one thing we can do, and we all can do so much. So it's been an honor. Thank you so much, Ipsita. I've loved talking with you today.
Thank you, Peggy. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh, well, I feel more committed than ever before, and I'm sure the same is the case for all of you. What a wonderful discussion. I now request Disha to invite Uma Sharma for the closing manifesto.